The day had passed just like every other day in Edward Paul's life. The greasy rag in his hands left smudges on his rough skin as he wiped them clean from working on the engines. The sun hung low, casting the small workshop in hues of amber and gold, while the chrome surfaces of half-dismantled cars glinted in the fading light. It was 6:30 p.m., according to the old clock hanging crooked on the wall, marking the end of another routine day. Edward sighed, locking up the garage for the night. The quiet streets of Millbrook, Iowa, stretched out before him, bathed in the gentle glow of the setting sun. He had walked these roads countless times, always the same rhythm, always the same faces. Mrs. Henderson was out in her yard, tending to her beloved petunias. Edward nodded politely, though the action was more out of habit than genuine acknowledgement. His mind was elsewhere. His apartment was a modest place, sitting atop Gus's hardware store. The wooden stairs creaked under his weight as he made his way up, the faint scent of motor oil and old pizza filling the air around him. Once inside, Edward shed his grease-stained coveralls and stepped into the shower. The warm water ran down his face, but it did little to wash away the lingering feeling of monotony. Every day felt like a repeat of the one before, blurring into an endless cycle of work, eat, sleep, and start over again. As he towel-dried his hair, something caught his eye. A crooked flyer stuck to the fridge. "Annual Millbrook Flea Market tonight," it read in bold letters, accompanied by a faded picture of tables covered in random knickknacks. Edward shrugged. He hadn't been to the flea market in years, but tonight, with nothing better to do, the idea didn't seem so bad. After slipping into a plain t-shirt and jeans, Edward grabbed his keys and headed out. The town square buzzed with activity, a stark contrast to its usual sleepy demeanor. Rows of folding tables were lined up under the old street lamps, groaning under the weight of used books, tarnished silverware, old tools, and trinkets that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. Edward walked through the market with no particular aim, his fingers trailing absent-mindedly over dusty book spines and rusted tools. Nothing truly caught his attention, though. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for, if anything at all. "See anything you like, son?" A gravelly voice cut through the chatter, startling Edward. He turned to find an old man sitting behind a rickety table, his face hidden beneath a scraggly white beard and a battered fedora. "Just browsing," Edward replied with a non-committal shrug. The old man chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with a strange glint. "Maybe you haven't found what you're looking for yet." He reached under the table and pulled out a small, ornate bottle that shimmered in the dim light. The colors on the bottle seemed to shift and dance as if the glass were alive, swirling with patterns Edward had never seen before. For a moment, Edward forgot to breathe. The bottle was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. What is that?" he asked, barely able to tear his gaze away from it. "Just an old curio," the man said with a knowing smile. "But I think she's been waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" Edward frowned, his practical mind kicking in. This sounded like one of those old-timey sales pitches designed to trap tourists into buying junk. But something about the bottle felt different. It didn't feel like junk, it felt important. "Some things choose their owners," the man said cryptically. "This one's had its eye on you since you walked in." He held the bottle out toward Edward. $20 and it's yours." Edward hesitated, his sensible side warring with the inexplicable pull he felt toward the object. His eyes flicked back to the old man, who gave him a wink, as if daring him to take the leap. Before he could overthink it, Edward found himself handing over a crumpled $20 bill. The bottle was surprisingly warm in his hands, its surface smooth and intricate. "Enjoy," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. But when Edward looked up again to ask another question, the man and his stall had vanished. Only an empty space remained where they had been just moments before. Disoriented, Edward glanced down at the bottle in his hands, half expecting it to disappear like the old man had. But it stayed, solid and real, pulsing gently with that same otherworldly glow. The walk home passed in a blur, his thoughts consumed by the strange encounter and the mysterious bottle now tucked safely in his jacket pocket. Once inside his apartment, Edward placed the bottle carefully on the kitchen counter. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, its colors seemed even more vivid, swirling and shifting in a way that almost hurt his eyes. He reached out, running his fingers over the intricate designs etched into the glass. The symbols looked like no alphabet he had ever seen, more like a constellation of stars than actual letters. As he traced one of the designs, a sudden jolt of static shot through his hand. "Ouch!" Edward jerked back, the bottle wobbling precariously on the counter. He lunged forward to catch it, his palm pressing against the smooth surface, just as the top of the bottle popped off with a sharp pop. The room exploded in a brilliant flash of light, forcing Edward to stumble backward, shielding his eyes. When the glow finally subsided, he blinked furiously to clear the spots from his vision. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing. Floating a few inches above his kitchen floor was a figure. A woman, but not like any woman Edward had ever seen. Her skin shimmered with a pale blue glow, as if stars themselves were dancing beneath the surface. Cascading white hair floated around her face, seemingly unaffected by gravity. And her eyes, oh, her eyes, were like swirling galaxies, deep and infinite. Edward's mouth opened, but no words came out. His brain simply refused to process the impossibility of the sight before him. The being tilted her head, studying him with a curiosity that sent shivers down Edward's spine. When she spoke, her voice was soft but resonated with a strange harmony, as if several tones were speaking at once. "I am Jenna," she said, her lips not quite in sync with the words. "You have awakened me, mortal, from my slumber. By the ancient cosmic laws, I am bound to grant you 3 wishes." Edward's back hit the refrigerator, knocking a cascade of takeout menus to the floor as he scrambled to regain his composure. What? Jenna's brow furrowed slightly. "Have I used the incorrect language? My translation matrix may require calibration." She waved a hand, and suddenly Edward felt a strange tingling in his ears. "Is this better?" she asked, her words now perfectly synced with her lips. Edward stared at her, his mind still reeling. Yes, I can understand you now, but—" He shook his head, trying to process everything. "Who are you? What are you?" A flicker of amusement crossed Jenna's ethereal face. "I am a quantum djinn, a being of energy and possibility. Your kind may refer to me as a genie, though the term lacks nuance." Edward blinked, still struggling to wrap his mind around the situation. "Genies aren't real," he mumbled. This can't be real." And yet," Jenna said, her voice steady, "here I am. Your disbelief, while understandable, does not negate my existence." Edward ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small kitchen. Okay. Let's say, hypothetically, that you are real. You mentioned something about wishes." Jenna nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, 3 wishes to be precise. It is the cosmic bargain. Freedom in exchange for wish fulfillment." The weight of those words sank into Edward like a lead anchor. Wishes. 3 wishes. Anything he wanted, just like that? Unlimited wealth, superhuman powers, the ability to fix anything with a touch? His mind raced with possibilities, but something in the back of his mind held him back. This seemed too good to be true. There had to be a catch. "What's the fine print?" he asked, folding his arms. "There are always strings attached with these kinds of things, right?" Jenna's lips curved into what might have been a smile. "You are clever, mortal. Indeed, there are limitations. I cannot bring back the dead, force love, or directly cause harm. Beyond that, the possibilities are vast, though often unpredictable. Wishes have a way of twisting themselves." Edward nodded slowly, processing the information. "And after the 3 wishes? What happens then?" Jenna's expression softened, and for the briefest moment, Edward thought he saw a flicker of sadness in her gaze. "I return to my vessel," she said quietly, awaiting the next summoner. "It is the way of things." "Oh," Edward frowned. The thought of Jenna being trapped in that tiny bottle again, waiting for some other poor fool to stumble upon her, didn't sit right with him. "That sounds awful," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "Isn't there any way to free you?" Jenna's eyes widened, surprise flashing across her face. "You would consider such a thing? Most mortals think only of their own desires." Edward shrugged, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. "It just doesn't seem fair, that's all. To be stuck granting other people's wishes forever." Jenna studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing through the silence as if trying to understand him on a deeper level. "You are unusual, Edward Paul," she said softly. "How do you know my name?" Edward asked, feeling a blush creep up his neck. Jenna smiled, just a ghost of one. "I know many things about you," she said. "It is part of the bond between Jinn and Summoner." Edward felt his heart race. This was only the beginning. Edward stared at Jenna for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing with questions and doubts. She floated inches above his kitchen floor, her glowing form an impossible vision of ethereal beauty and otherworldly power. He had never felt so small in his life, yet the connection between them was palpable. Her words echoed in his mind. 3 wishes, freedom in exchange. The weight of those possibilities pressed down on him, almost suffocating in its enormity. He paced around the kitchen, his thoughts spiraling as Jenna remained still, her eyes following his every movement. Edward couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that there was more to this than just wishes. Nothing in life was that simple, and he wasn't naive enough to believe in free miracles. Wishes always had a way of turning sour, especially in the stories he had grown up with. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and usually ended in regret. "What are you thinking, Edward Paul?" Jenna's voice broke through his reverie, her tone calm but curious. Edward stopped pacing and ran a hand through his hair. "I'm thinking." "Why me?" He looked at her, eyes searching for answers. "Out of all the people in the world, why was it me who found that bottle? Why did you appear to me?" Jenna tilted her head slightly as if considering his question. "Some things are not governed by logic as you understand it. The universe moves in ways that even I, a being of quantum nature, cannot fully explain. Perhaps it was chance. Perhaps it was fate. Or perhaps," she added, her eyes locking with his, "it was simply the right moment for both of us." Edward frowned, unsure if he found comfort in her response or if it only added to his confusion. "But there has to be a reason why this happened, why you're here, and why I have to make these choices now." He let out a frustrated sigh. "I can't just wish for anything without thinking it through. What if I mess up? What if it backfires?" Jenna's lips curved into a soft, almost amused smile. "You are wise to hesitate, Edward. Many before you have rushed into their desires without fully grasping the consequences." She floated closer to him, her presence both soothing and overwhelming at the same time. "But it is not my place to decide for you. My role is merely to grant your wishes, and to ensure they follow the cosmic rules. How you choose to use them, or if you choose to use them at all, is entirely up to you." Edward leaned against the kitchen counter, his mind spinning with the weight of the decision ahead. "Has anyone ever not used their wishes?" he asked cautiously, almost afraid of the answer. Jenna's expression changed, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her features. "Very few," she said quietly. "Most mortals, when presented with the power to alter their reality, cannot resist the temptation. Even those who hesitate, as you do now, eventually give in." Edward nodded, trying to imagine what it must be like for Jenna to encounter human after human, each one eager to exploit her power. It made him wonder, what had her life been like before? What had she seen, experienced, over the course of what must have been millennia? "You've been doing this a long time, haven't you?" Edward asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Granting wishes, moving from one bottle to the next?" Jenna's eyes softened, and for the first time she seemed almost tired. "Longer than you can imagine," she replied. "I have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the creation of empires, and the destruction of entire worlds. My purpose has always been the same: to grant the wishes of those who summon me." Edward found himself growing more intrigued by the moment. "So you've seen everything then? All kinds of wishes?" A ghost of a smile touched Jenna's lips. "Indeed, mortals are endlessly creative in their desires, though they are often short-sighted. I have granted wishes for wealth, power, love, immortality, and yet so few have found the true happiness they seek." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Edward couldn't help but feel the weight of that truth. He had seen enough in his own life to understand that no amount of money or fame could fill the emptiness inside a person. And yet the allure of having such power at his fingertips was hard to ignore. "What about you?" Edward asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. "Have you ever wanted something for yourself?" Jenna blinked, as if the thought had never occurred to her. "I am not accustomed to thinking in such terms. My existence is tied to the cosmic laws, and I exist to serve the desires of others. Wanting for myself is—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Irrelevant." Edward felt a pang of sympathy for her. It didn't seem fair. This being, with all her knowledge and power, had spent who knows how long fulfilling other people's whims without ever considering her own. "That doesn't seem right," he muttered. Jenna gave him a curious look. "Why do you say that?" "Because I don't know." "Everyone should have the chance to want something for themselves, shouldn't they? Even you." Edward shifted awkwardly, suddenly feeling out of his depth. "I mean, it just doesn't seem fair that you're stuck doing this for eternity." Jenna regarded him thoughtfully. "You are unusual, Edward Paul. Most mortals think only of how they can use me for their own gain. Few have ever considered my position." Edward shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed by her words. I don't know. It doesn't sit right with me, that's all." For a moment silence hung between them. Edward couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Jenna than met the eye. Her ancient wisdom, her calm demeanor. There was a depth to her that went far beyond what he could comprehend. And yet, here she was, offering him the chance to change his life forever. But what would he even wish for? As if reading his thoughts, Jenna spoke again. You hesitate because you fear the consequences of your choices. That is understandable. But perhaps there is a way to use your wishes without bringing harm. Edward looked up at her, intrigued. What do you mean? Jenna floated closer, her glowing form casting soft light across the room. You could use your first wish to test the boundaries, to see how the power works, and to understand its limitations. Edward frowned. Like a practice wish? Of sorts, Jenna replied. A wish that is small in scale yet meaningful enough for you to gauge the effects. It would allow you to proceed with caution. Edward considered her words carefully. It wasn't a bad idea, but what kind of small wish would be worth testing? He didn't want to waste one of his 3 wishes on something trivial, but he also didn't want to rush into anything big without fully understanding the risks. What about you? Edward asked, the idea forming in his mind. If I wished for something for you, would that work? Jenna's eyes widened slightly in surprise. For me? Yeah, Edward said, nodding. What if I wished for you to have something? Something you want? Would that count as a real wish? Jenna seemed taken aback, as if the thought had never crossed her mind. It would count, yes, she said slowly. But as I said before, my existence is not tied to desires for myself. I do not wish for anything. Edward felt a surge of frustration. But what if you did? What if you wanted to be free, or to live your own life without having to grant wishes for eternity? Wouldn't that be worth something? Jenna's expression softened, and for a brief moment Edward thought he saw a flicker of something, longing, perhaps, in her gaze. Freedom, she whispered almost to herself. It is a concept that has eluded me for millennia. Edward's heart raced. So it is something you want? Jenna met his eyes, her voice soft but steady. It is complicated. The cosmic laws bind me to this existence. Even if I desired freedom, it is not as simple as making a wish. Edward stepped forward, his mind spinning with possibilities. What if I could wish for that, though? What if I used one of my wishes to set you free? Jenna's gaze held his, her expression unreadable. The price of such a wish would be great, Edward Paul. Freedom is not granted easily, and it would require more than just a wish to undo the bonds that tie me to this world. But it's possible, right? Edward pressed, his determination growing. There's a way to do it? Jenna hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. There is one way, but it comes with its own complexities. Edward's heart pounded in his chest. Tell me. Jenna floated closer, her voice barely above a whisper. If a jinn were to bind themselves in marriage to a mortal, the nature of the wish-granting would change. The spouse would have access to unlimited wishes, but the jinn would no longer be bound to their bottle or to the cosmic laws. Edward's eyes widened in shock. Marriage? Like actual marriage? Jenna nodded. It is a joining of essences, a merging of mortal and cosmic energies. It has happened only a handful of times in history. Edward's mind reeled with the implications. So, you'd be free, but we'd be married? Jenna tilted her head, her gaze searching his. Yes, it is a profound connection, beyond what your kind typically experiences in marriage. Edward took a step back, running a hand through his hair. That's a lot to take in. Jenna's voice was calm, but there was a hint of something deeper there. Something vulnerable. I did not suggest we pursue it, Edward Paul. I merely explained the possibility. Edward felt his face flush. Right, of course. I didn't mean to imply. I mean, you're beautiful and... But Jenna's soft laughter filled the room, a sound like distant chimes. Your honesty is refreshing, Edward. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling like an idiot. I'm just trying to figure this out. Jenna floated closer, her eyes locking with his. You have much to consider, Edward Paul. The choice is not an easy one. Edward nodded, his mind spinning. Yeah, I know. I need time to think. Jenna's expression softened. Take all the time you need. And with that, the conversation came to a close, leaving Edward to grapple with the enormity of the decisions ahead. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The air in the apartment was thick with the weight of unspoken decisions. Edward paced the narrow space between the kitchen and the small living room, Jenna hovering nearby, her presence both soothing and heavy with anticipation. She watched him with an expression that was difficult to read, part curiosity, part patience, and perhaps, though he couldn't be sure, part longing. Edward had always considered himself practical. Life in a small town had shaped him into someone who preferred simple solutions, clear paths forward, and predictable outcomes. Wishes, though, were the opposite of all that. They were unknown, unpredictable, and filled with risks he couldn't fully anticipate. Yet here he was, standing on the precipice of something that could change his entire life. "I'm still not sure I want to use any of these wishes," Edward admitted, running a hand through his hair, his thoughts swirling in a million directions. "There's so much that could go wrong." Jenna drifted closer, her shimmering presence casting a soft glow over the room. "You are wise to be cautious," she said, her voice gentle. "But inaction is also a choice, and time is not a resource that flows endlessly." Edward glanced up at her, his brow furrowed. "Are you saying I need to decide now?" Jenna shook her head, her ethereal hair floating in soft waves. "No, but there is power in intention, Edward Paul. Your life is already changing because of my presence here. Your hesitations, your uncertainties, they shape your path as much as any wish could." Her words hung in the air, and Edward found himself drawn to the idea of making a choice, any choice, that might lift him out of the monotony he'd been feeling for so long. Could a wish really solve that? Could it pull him from the rut of his everyday existence? The same routines? The same people? The same emptiness? After a long pause, he exhaled slowly and said, I think I'm ready to make my first wish." Jenna's eyes gleamed with an unreadable emotion, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Edward stood still, his mind searching for something that felt right. Not too big, not too small, something that wouldn't spiral out of control. "Okay," he said, his voice firmer now. "I wish that I could fix any machine I touch, no matter how broken it is." Jenna's lips curved into a small, approving smile. "A practical wish, fitting for one of your talents." Edward watched as she extended her hand, palm facing upward, and a soft, shimmering light began to glow around her fingers. The light grew brighter, wrapping itself around her form before slowly seeping into Edward, causing a tingling sensation to spread through his body. It wasn't painful, just strange, like an electric current passing through him, charging him with a newfound energy. When the light faded, Edward stood there, slightly breathless. The kitchen was as it had been before, and nothing seemed to have changed. He flexed his fingers, half expecting some kind of immediate sensation, but nothing came. He looked at Jenna, unsure. "That's it? Did it work?" Jenna's smile remained, serene and patient. "You will know when the time comes." Edward huffed a small laugh, a mixture of relief and disbelief. It seemed too easy, too simple for something as monumental as a wish. But it was done. The first wish was made, and the world hadn't collapsed around him. He still felt like himself, still had control. That was a start. "Now what?" he asked, half joking. But there was genuine curiosity behind his words. "Now," Jenna said softly, "you live. You continue to walk your path, and when you encounter something that needs fixing, you will know your wish has taken root." Edward found himself staring at her, the gravity of the moment fading into something more familiar. Jenna wasn't just some cosmic entity anymore. She was becoming someone he could talk to, someone he could trust. The realization settled into him slowly, like the first glimmers of sunrise after a long, dark night. Their conversations, her presence, it was all beginning to feel right. Over the next few days, life seemed to shift subtly for Edward. It wasn't that anything major changed, but there was a lightness in his step, a subtle shift in the way he approached the world. The mundane aspects of his job at the garage took on a new sense of purpose. He found himself thinking back to his wish, wondering when it would kick in, wondering how it would feel to bring a machine back to life with just a touch. And then it happened. It was late one afternoon, and Edward had been working on a stubborn old Chevy for what felt like hours. The engine was a mess, wires crossed, parts rusted beyond repair, and everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. Edward wiped the sweat from his brow and stared at the pile of metal in frustration. But something inside him shifted. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers grazing the engine's surface. A warmth spread through his hand. Not the usual heat from the shop, but something deeper, more vibrant. He could feel the machine, its broken pieces, its dysfunctions. And then, just like that, they began to mend. Piece by piece, the engine's parts clicked into place, wires reconnected, Bolts tightened, and rusted metal gleamed with new life. Edward watched in stunned silence as the old Chevy's engine transformed before his eyes. When he stepped back, the machine purred to life as if it had never been broken in the first place. He stood there for a moment, the full weight of what he'd done sinking in. His first wish had worked. He had fixed the engine. No tools, no hours of labor, just a touch. It was exhilarating and yet unnerving. Jenna appeared in the doorway of the garage, her form glowing faintly in the late afternoon light. "I see your wish has come to fruition," she said softly, her voice full of quiet pride. Edward wiped his hands on a rag, his heart still racing from the experience. "Yeah, I guess it has." She floated closer, her eyes full of that unreadable depth he was starting to recognize. "How does it feel?" Edward paused, considering the question. "It feels incredible," he admitted, "but also kind of strange, like I've just unlocked something I didn't even know was possible." Jenna smiled, her expression warm. "That is the nature of wishes, Edward Paul. They reveal possibilities you hadn't considered." He studied her for a moment, his thoughts racing back to the conversation they'd had about freedom, about what Jenna really wanted. He hadn't forgotten. In fact, it had been on his mind more than he cared to admit. And now, having tasted the power of his first wish, the thought of using another to help Jenna lingered even more. "About what we talked about before," Edward began, his voice hesitant. "About freeing you." Jenna's expression softened, but there was a trace of caution in her gaze. "Yes? I've been thinking about it," he continued, "and I want to help you. I don't know if it's possible, or if it's even something you want, but it feels wrong that you're bound to this existence, to these rules." Jenna's gaze remained steady, but her voice was tinged with sadness. "It is a kind offer, Edward, but my existence is tied to the cosmic laws. To undo them would require more than just a wish. It would require a change in the very fabric of what I am." Edward frowned, his mind working through the implications. "But if we did the marriage thing you mentioned, would that change it?" Jenna hesitated, her gaze flickering with emotions he couldn't fully read. "Yes," she said slowly, "it would free me from the bottle, from the cosmic laws. But it would also bind me to you in ways that are deeper than you can imagine." Edward felt his heart race. The idea of being bound to Jenna, of sharing a life, of being connected in such a profound way, was both thrilling and terrifying. He hadn't even known her that long, and yet there was something undeniable between them, something that went beyond the surface of their interactions. "I don't want to rush into anything," Edward said carefully, "but I also don't want you to be trapped. I want to help you." Jenna floated closer, her gaze softening. "Your compassion is rare, Edward Paul, but this decision is not one to be made lightly. The bond that would form between us is eternal. It is not something that can be undone." Edward swallowed, his mind spinning with the weight of her words. He wasn't sure he was ready for something that monumental, but the thought of leaving Jenna in her current state, bound to her bottle, forced to grant wishes for eternity, felt even worse. "I need to think about it," he admitted, his voice quieter now. Jenna nodded, her expression understanding. "Take all the time you need. This choice is yours to make, and I will not pressure you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion for Edward. Every time he saw Jenna, he felt the pull between them growing stronger. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, wise, kind, and full of mystery. And yet there was a sadness beneath her calm exterior, a longing for something more, something that only he could give her. The more time they spent together, the more Edward found himself falling for her. It wasn't just the allure of her power or the mystery of her origins. It was her, Jenna, the being who had seen galaxies rise and fall, yet found beauty in the simple things. She had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. And now, the thought of losing her, of letting her return to that bottle, felt unbearable. One evening, as they sat together in his apartment, Edward turned to Jenna, his heart heavy with the decision he knew he had to make. "I've made up my mind," he said quietly. Jenna looked at him, her eyes full of both hope and apprehension. "I want to help you," Edward continued. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I can't let you go back to that bottle. I want to set you free. I want us to be connected." Jenna's gaze softened, and for a moment she seemed almost vulnerable. "Are you certain, Edward Paul?" He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I am." Jenna smiled, a radiant, beautiful smile that filled the room with light. "Then I accept, Edward Paul. We will be bound, for better or for worse." And with those words, everything changed. The evening after Edward made his decision, the air around him seemed to shimmer with new energy. He could feel it deep in his bones, the weight of the bond between him and Jenna. She was no longer bound to her bottle, no longer shackled by the cosmic laws that had once dictated her every action. They were connected now, intertwined in a way that transcended anything Edward had ever imagined. But with that bond came the unknown, and soon that uncertainty would take on a form neither of them could have foreseen. The first sign of trouble came early the next morning. Edward was in his apartment, finishing his coffee and preparing for another routine day at the garage. The hum of the coffee machine filled the small kitchen, and the sunlight filtered through the windows, casting golden light on the countertops. Everything seemed normal, until the world outside his window shifted. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the sky, a distortion in the air, like a ripple passing through water. Edward squinted, stepping closer to the window to get a better look. But the moment he moved, the ripple intensified. The sky darkened unnaturally, and the soft hum of the morning turned into an eerie silence. "Jenna?" Edward called, his voice laced with unease. Jenna materialized beside him in an instant, her expression sharp and alert. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice steady but full of tension. "I can feel it." Before Edward could respond, the ripple outside expanded, distorting the very fabric of reality. The air crackled with energy, and then, without warning, figures began to materialize. Tall, ominous shapes dressed in flowing robes, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They radiated power, an ancient and terrifying kind of power that made the hair on the back of Edward's neck stand on end. "The Enforcers," Jenna whispered, her voice tight with fear. Edward's heart raced. "The Cosmic Enforcers? But why are they here? They must have detected the disturbance, the change in my status." Jenna's gaze flickered with both anger and apprehension. "They've come to reclaim me." "Why?" Before Edward could fully process what she was saying, the lead enforcer stepped forward, his voice booming across the space between them. "Jenna, Quantum Jinn of the Eighth Realm, you stand accused of violating the Cosmic Compact. You have unbound yourself from your bottle and forged a union with a mortal. This is a violation of universal law." Edward stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "She didn't violate anything. I made the wish. I set her free." The enforcer's hooded gaze turned toward Edward, and though he couldn't see the being's eyes, he felt the weight of its stare bearing down on him. "You, Edward Paul, have interfered with the balance of the universe. By releasing Jenna, you have altered the natural order. This cannot be allowed to stand."